Good morning and welcome back to World Talks. And for those of you who are just joining us, we're going to discuss the latest developments in Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenski has been making repeated pleas to his Western allies to allow Ukraine to use long-range weapons to strike deep inside the Russian territory. Yet, the US remains adamant about upholding the ban. Why is that, and what can this mean for Ukraine's war effort? To discuss, I am joined by Amanda Paul, Deputy Head, Europe in the Work Programme, European Policy Centre. Good morning. Thank you for agreeing to speak with us. Much appreciated.
Good morning to you too. Thank you for the invitation.
All right, well, so let's discuss Ramstein. Zelensky went there in person, tried to convince, I presume, Lloyd Austin in particular, to allow him to use long-range weapons, yet the answer was no, right? So what happens next? Do you think that Zelensky will keep on trying? Will there be some other measures introduced? What happens now?
I mean, to be honest, I don't think that President Zelensky has any other option but to continue trying. It's extremely disappointing that we still have the same response from the Americans, which is no. This reflects still ongoing concerns about further escalation, or concerns that the Russians would escalate and potentially use nuclear weapons. So they're still imposing this red line. This is a ridiculously short-sighted approach, and it's costing Ukrainian lives almost every hour, if not more. So President Zelensky, other Ukrainians, other allies, including Poland, need to continue to press the Americans to change this approach.
Right, but I mean, why are the Americans different in this approach to some of the European countries? For instance, the UK, I mean, David Cameron, while he was still in office, already said that it's okay to use storm shadows, right, for Ukrainians to use storm shadows to strike Russian territory. So why is the US sort of lagging behind?
I mean, some of the allies are nearer to Russia, so they're nearer to the war, so they feel the threat to European security much more acutely, including obviously Ukraine's direct neighbors. The United States is on the other side of the ocean, so perhaps the threat isn't felt so acutely by everybody. I mean, the UK always want to put themselves at the front of the pack. They want to show themselves to be a great, let's say, global player, a big security actor, doing the right thing. But at the end of the day, the Americans have, throughout this war, since the first days, have been extremely cautious, much more cautious than some countries. There's many that sit in Washington that are really convinced that President Putin will turn to nuclear arms if he finds himself in a very desperate situation. Of course, this is very debatable. And to be frank, I think that we should not be worrying about how President Putin should react. We should be doing what needs to be done for Ukraine to be victorious.
Right, but don't you think that the American politicians are sort of treading carefully because they're still, I mean, the November vote is still to take place, and perhaps they're trying to gauge their response. Perhaps something will change in the fall. What is your take on that?
I mean, that's possible, but let's remember there's been other occasions since the beginning of the full-scale invasion where the Americans have been very cautious as well, and there was no election in sight. I hope that it's going to be the case that, you know, after the elections, in the event of a democratic victory, that we would see a change of position here. Also, I mean, President Zelensky has been very explicit in how they would use these long-range ATACMS. I mean, he presented the list to Washington. He's probably also hoping that after the votes they'll get the result that they want. But let's keep our fingers crossed. But I don't think we should be feeling 100% sure this is what's going to happen.
Right, and there's been much talk that the Russian red lines are actually not really there. I mean, it's just, you know, for the optics they're saying this, right? So do you think that the threat is still there, or perhaps no longer, and the Western countries began to see that?
I mean, when it comes to Russia using nukes, Of course, we can't be 100% sure that they won't. That's very clear. But since the beginning of the invasion, the Russians had a very long list of red lines. Most of those red lines have already been crossed, and what we've seen as a response from Russia is not what, let's say, Putin and others in his regime have said they would do. We've seen that with Ukraine's incursion into Kursk. The Russian response has been pretty much very mild. So there's always going to be a risk here. But what we need to consider is what's at stake here. This is not just about Ukraine as an independent, sovereign country, which of course is the most important thing, but it's also about European and Euro-Atlantic security as a whole. It's about maintaining the current rules-based order. The impact of not giving Ukraine what it needs to be victorious, to push the Russians back, to put them in a position of strength when Ukraine would go to the negotiating table, is playing straight into President Putin's hands and making him feel empowered, which is the absolute opposite to where Ukraine needs to be, or where the allies need to be at this point.
Right, and let me ask you about Ukraine itself, because we've seen this recent government reshuffle, but I mean some of the same people still stayed in power, right? Just in different positions. But my question was, why was this done precisely, right? Is it in order to present a different image of Ukraine to the West? Perhaps this is what Zelensky is trying to accomplish. So what was the purpose, and how is it being received?
I mean, this is sort of $1 million question, if you want to put it that way. But as President Zelensky said himself, I mean, many of these people had been in their roles for a long time, since the beginning of his presidency. So it was sort of a refreshment, a reshuffle. Personally, I found it a bit disappointing and a surprise that Foreign Minister Kuleba was removed from his position, because he was an excellent foreign minister and very well received throughout the world, actually. He had established very good ties with many countries, including in the global south, and a high degree of trust between Kuleba and his counterparts. But that said, his replacement, who was the deputy minister, is also an excellent diplomat. So I do believe there will be a continuation of the same policy and good relations. I think for many of Ukraine's allies, it did come as a bit of a surprise that so many ministers were sort of removed or shuffled around. But as you rightly said, many of them have been reappointed either into their old job, perhaps with some extra work, or shuffled into a new position. But at this point in time, the most important thing is maintaining, political stability in Ukraine, that with the ongoing support from the allies.
Right, and speaking of political stability, Zelensky did this whole reshuffling while he himself is staying in power because of the martial law, right? Because normally his term would have ended already. So how is that being viewed? Do you think it's a bit controversial, perhaps?
I don't think it's that controversial because, Ukraine's in the middle of a full-scale war. It would be very difficult to hold elections. As you said, there's martial law. It doesn't really make that much sense to have this sort of upheaval. The Ukrainian population are still very supportive of President Zelensky. He's proven himself to be a brilliant wartime leader and strategist, so he has a huge amount of confidence. Of course, sometime in the future, there will need to be elections. I mean, Ukraine is a democracy. It has a history of holding, elections on time. I think this is a very unique situation that will eventually end in an election once the war comes to an end.
Right, and let's just take a closer look at Europe for a moment, because there are countries in the EU such as Hungary and Slovakia, which are not very supportive of Ukraine. And so do you think that the EU can do something to bring them back into the fold and sort of pursue this fairly uniform policy towards aiding Ukraine? Will something be done? What is your assessment of the situation?
I mean, to be frank, I think it's more pragmatic and realistic that the EU need to continue to understand that particularly Hungary is going to be a difficult country to deal with, on Ukraine, but not just on Ukraine. I mean, we're now in the midst of the Hungarian presidency of the EU, and nothing can be done at this point to, let's say, push forward with Ukraine's accession negotiations to any great extent. Hence, the first chapters regarding fundamentals won't be opened until we move to the Polish presidency. And Hungary also continues to block the facility that allows member states to be refunded from arms that they deliver to Ukraine. This is very detrimental. As long as Viktor Orban is in power, I don't see there's going to be a significant change in his approach, at least in the short term. Of course, the EU needs to continue to be creative in ways to get around his potential vetoes and blockades of different initiatives, and so this should be really the thinking, because I don't see a change from Budapest in the near future.
So just my last question about military support from the EU for Ukraine. There was this initiative about, aimed to provide artillery shells, right, to Ukraine. However, it was a great initiative, it still is, but it was criticized, the timing, right, the execution of it was criticized, that it's still not all there. So what can be done to sort of expedite some of these processes of delivering weapons to Ukraine, on the part of the EU, of course?
I mean, first of all, I'm an EU citizen, and to be frank, I feel deeply ashamed about the failure of the EU to deliver not only these shells on time, but many other pieces of weapons and equipment to Ukraine that was promised. It's taken the EU a very long time to get its act together, and it's only now that we're starting to see, let's say, the rejuvenation of their defence sector coming to fruition. So there needs to be, a bigger push, more momentum from all those member states involved to getting the weapons, including the shells, to Ukraine. I mean, now security and defence, or the defence of European defence, has become a priority for the EU. So we've seen a shift in position, where before that there was really a sort of laissez-faire approach to it. Of course, again, there's some member states, including your own, the Czech Republic and the Baltics, who have a much more sort of prioritization of these issues. In the EU, there's still too much talking or self-congratulation on what they've done for Ukraine and talking about what they can do, rather than actually doing it. They need to do more doing and much less talking.
And on this note, we're going to conclude with that appeal. Amanda, Paul, thank you so much for being with us and for your insights. Much appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you for the invitation.
And thank you for watching World Talks. Please stay tuned for more here on TPP World.